Ever since Game of Thrones ended, fantasy TV hasn't quite been the same. It's felt a bit empty. In the meantime, there have been a few sci-fi shows that have stepped up, rising in the pop culture zeitgeist, grabbing more attention on streaming, and honestly, outshining fantasy. We watched a bunch of fantasy series try to make a splash, and many of them were obviously trying to be the next Game of Thrones. But too many of them just don't stick the landing with fans or regular viewers or critics. In the minds of many, Amazon Studios has taken a lot of the heat for this, especially with their failures with divisive offerings like the Rings of Power and their Wheel of Time series. And this was noted by Brandon Sanderson, a very well-known, respected writer himself of fantasy. And this is an article from Screen Rant covering his recent comments. Streaming has had a big problem with epic fantasy. Author Brandon Sanderson weighs in on fantasy TV, cites Rings of Power and Wheel of Time as disappointments. So in regards to Wheel of Time, he participated in the continuation of that book series. I think he was involved, at least in an executive producer credit to Amazon's Wheel of Time show, which I'll be honest with you, I actually forgot was still in development. I just saw a promo for season 3 and legit I forgot about it. Esteemed fantasy author Brandon Sanderson has expressed his disappointment with attempts to bring epic fantasy to streaming television, citing responses to The Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings of Power. Perhaps best known for his Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive novels, Sanderson was selected to complete Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time series following the author's death in 2007. It was a natural fit given Sanderson's insistence on developing cohesive magic systems. In 2022, Sanderson would also create a record-breaking Kickstarter campaign, generating almost $42 million to self-publish 4 novels penned during the COVID pandemic. Speaking with Polygon, Sanderson was asked about potential adaptation of his solo works, admitting that while he has had a lot of offers for the Stormlight Archive, he has rejected them all, as he does not yet feel the time is right. Instead, he suggested that streaming television has yet to figure out the correct approach to the genre. As proof, he cited the response to Prime Video's The Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings of Power, along with Netflix's canceled Shadow and Bone series. And he said, quote, "I'm not convinced that we have hit stability in the streaming market. Streaming has had a big problem with epic fantasy, and this has me worried. Rings of Power and Wheel of Time have not gone as well as I would have hoped. Shadow and Bone lasted only 2 seasons after a very strong first season. Streaming hasn't figured out epic fantasy yet." It's so strange, fantasy specifically, why this is such a major issue on streaming platforms. And I just read a story too that A Court of Thorns and Roses, that's a romantasy book series, but it's popular, but that's been in development for a long time and now it's just officially canceled. And the stuff that has made it through has had very troubled productions. The Witcher needs to be part of this conversation too, which he sees this, and as an acclaimed author himself, numerous original fantasy works, and he's had so many offers for the Stormlight books. And he's just said, no, I can't see that happening yet because the streaming landscape itself is so chaotic and something needs to change for there to be stability and for any adaptation moving forward, at least for him personally, for his works, he needs to have some assurance that this is going to be successful. He suggested that audiences have not experienced any great epic fantasy television since the early seasons of Game of Thrones. Sanderson also posits that much of the issue lies in the vestiges of an older episodic television model rather than budgetary constraints. And he says, quote, "Maybe this is a holdover from network television days, where they're trying to make the episodes fit into the structure of how episodic television used to work, rather than filming an 8-hour movie and showing it in chunks. But maybe that's a bad idea. All I know is right now we haven't seen really great epic fantasy film television since the early mid-seasons of Game of Thrones. $50 million per episode has not done it, so it's not a matter of the money they're throwing at it." That's interesting about the episodic nature of the glory days, I guess, of network television. Mostly it's now just serialized, just one single story, like he puts it, an 8-hour movie split up into chunks. And is that good for fantasy? Does that make for a show that can be established and garner a fan base and have that continual success? I think streaming has really watered down people's expectations for maybe fantasy shows specifically, because it just seems like content for content's sake, as opposed to a genuine attempt to bring an epic fantasy story to life and to create something that will be remembered in pop culture. Way back when there was Xena, Warrior Princess, they had Hercules, they had so many Arthurian shows. I miss those days. I think science fiction now, when it comes to streaming, they have a better handle on it. But I miss those days of episodic science fiction shows. Babylon 5, I think maybe that's the answer. I honestly think that's how you should do it, that there's a balance to be had between, I guess, what they now call filler episodes of just week-to-week episodes contained within themselves. And throughout, there's that thread of a continual storyline that will eventually lead up to the finale. And that seemed to be kind of a formula that a lot of shows carried on from. Epic fantasy, these stories are so rich, and to narrow them down or streamline or water them down takes away what makes them so epic in the first place, which is to show the passage of time, to show people traversing these huge landscapes and doing these little filler episodes, these little bottle episodes, to where we can get to know the characters, and the characters can establish these bonds of friendship. And we also, as the audience, grow closer in attachment to the characters. But fantasy in that regard, yeah, it's just very short seasons, and it takes years between each season. That's another thing. Before, we had like 24 plus episodes in a show every year, and it was a continual thing, which is another thing too, and how this is released. Netflix just dumps all these shows, all episodes all at once. Very rarely do they split it up. I think they did it for Stranger Things and Cobra Kai, splitting it up in parts. But by and large, all of the season is just dumped at one time. And you never have that time to create that pop culture impact, to talk about the latest episodes with your friends, your coworkers, your colleagues, your schoolmates, and all that. That's part of the fun, and that's part of what makes something last in the public eye and create that impact in the pop culture sphere. Netflix itself is probably the most popular streaming service for this kind of content, but no show is safe. If it's not watched, if it doesn't get sufficient numbers, it's canceled. I also think that Netflix is the main driver for why people just don't view these shows with the same weight or expectation. And if it's all just dumped out at once, it's never given its full due. There's also quality. That's another part of the conversation. In regards to other ones like Amazon, which does release their episodes weekly, the quality isn't there. They very much rely on solely the fame of the IP, and that's the most important thing. They'll shell out some money to just get this thing made, but they don't care about the quality or whether or not it will make an impression in fans and audiences' minds and whether or not they'll like it. It's not important to them. They just want the IP. They want Wheel of Time. They want the Lord of the Rings. And that's all that matters. It's a shame. But I think in terms of what Brandon Sanderson is saying, the way that these stories of epic fantasy are handled, you have inexperienced people who are not qualified, who are not good at handling productions of this scale when it comes to certain stories and certain IPs. Something that I think fantasy itself needs is just that sense of time and scale of immersion into these very unique worlds. And so often it's just not given its full due. When it comes to Rings of Power, like all of Middle Earth just seems so small. And the characters, we don't really care about them because we haven't spent much time anywhere, and coupled with inexperienced writing. So all of this combines to just a very hostile environment for epic fantasy. You just haven't figured this stuff out yet. It seems simple. The problems are glaring. They just refuse to see them. The next big fantasy production is the Harry Potter TV series on HBO Max. That's going to be huge, and it's a huge responsibility. I'm actually really excited because of the potential that they have for this long form television format to really dive into the details of the books and take your time in immersing the audience into this world and its characters and elements that weren't able to be focused on in the shorter feature film format. So this could be a great opportunity to highlight the possibilities of what fantasy can be on streaming, but there is a lot of pressure on this genre genre specifically and on streaming, and hopefully they handle it well. And hopefully it will mean a change into this genre specifically, highlight what can be possible if you adhere to the source material, if you really build out the world and spend time fleshing out the characters and the stories, and have a release strategy that really makes you stand out for longer periods of time. Hopefully change is on the horizon, because right now it is depressing how many failures there have been in this genre specifically. Hopefully this will change, and Brandon Sanderson might see one of his book series adapted if that change happens. But I'm curious to know what you make of Brandon Sanderson's comments about the failure of fantasy on streaming. What do you think are the biggest contributing factors for why studios like Amazon and Netflix have missed the mark? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe for more sci-fi and fantasy news, theories, and lore. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, you can leave a super thanks or join as a YouTube member for early access to new videos and other perks. You can also check out my Patreon page for exclusive content. Thank you all so much for your support, and as always, have a very nerdy day.